Okay, let's get started. Today, for the Android class, it is all about Android storage. And I'm going to go through the Notepad example that I was trying to go through last week, but I was having problems with my emulator. So I decided to get upgrade. So I've upgraded to the 4.01 emulator. Actually, 4.03 is I think what I've got. So we'll see it working on that. I'm not quite sure why the other emulator wasn't working. Who knows? It's always something new. So emulators in Android are always a battle. But for today, talking about Android storage, we only have really two kind of storage options. We have the database, which is what I'm going to demo with the Notepad application. And then we have files. So you can store things with data files. You can bring stuff in from the resource directory from a form of a file. A file is kind of slow. If you think about the concept of the file, you're reading and writing to something that's going to be on the SD card, assuming that everybody has an SD card, which most users do at this point, but it does require it. The database actually doesn't require the SD card. Instead, the database runs on the phone itself and provides a little bit more seamless, integrated kind of application development approach to use data persistently and without having to read and write to files, because you can use the database. Well, if you write to the database in one application, you can only read it from that application. There's some security issues associated with that. But it does provide you a good way of storing data, and we'll see that with the Notepad example. So there's several different options for storage of data with Android. You can put the data into a preferences file. You can put the data into a normal file, so there's two forms of files. And you can send data across the network to a service to be used by another service, or we can use the database. And the database seems to be the fastest sort of approach these days. But let's talk about preference files first. So preference files are lightweight options. Well, they're small. I sort of think of them like cookie files, but they don't have the same connotation as the cookie file. They can't be read by everybody else. They can only be read by the application. So you can put data into what's called a preferences file, and you can call the context.getSharedPreferences to read and write values as key value pairs. Kind of like a database where we can set, for Notepad, size of screen or number of lines or something, some parameter we can set, save it, and so that next time when we open it up, it reads the preferences file. You can use the activity.getPreferences with no name to keep them private to the calling activity. So you can kind of, if you don't give it a name, you're setting a preference that can only be used by the application that has created it, essentially, because nobody else is going to be able to figure out how to use it. And preferences, these are not shareable across different applications, so unless you expose them as content provider. So the content provider concept, if you're going to create features of your application that are going to be used among multiple different applications, you're going to go the content provider route. And that would be something like, for example, the address book on the phone. So if you wanted to be able to, keep names and addresses, and you're going to use an address book, use the phones from the content provider, use that address book. And then that can be used in email, can be used in the dialing programs, can be used in text messaging. And it's really easy to put together, as an example, a text messaging application using the content provider, which means you have access to the entire information that's on the phone. That's normally how data is being shared on the phone. When you start creating databases and you start creating tables in the databases, or when you start adding things to files, which is different than the preference file, then you start separating the data out application by application. So as a lightweight way of saving data, preferences comes in handy. The drawback to the preference file approach is that you have that key value kind of thing. So you can say screen size is equal to something, and if you think about all the different preferences you could possibly save in an application, it's basically the purpose of that originally. There's people that use this for databases as well. And essentially, it could be, it could be first name, last name, address, telephone number. You could put all that stuff in a preference file. There's no law that says you can't do that. But logically, I would think that would probably belong more in a database than it would in a preference file. But if you wanted to keep data, store data, preferences make some pretty good sense for a lot of different things. So you can write larger data files that aren't preferences. So the easiest way to go about this is to use the context.getSharedPreferences, read and write values in key value pairs, kind of like a hash table actually, or dictionary I should say. Bring them up, can't share them across multiple applications. Then we can take it a step further and say, well, I want to specify my own format for this particular file. I don't want to have to use preferences with key value combinations. I just want to read a text from a file. And we actually had an application earlier when I was talking about data from a different perspective earlier in the course. I showed you how to bring up a file and load the contents of a file into a toast message actually, or I believe it was what the example was doing. But that was just, kind of a low level kind of way of doing something in terms of reading from a file. So you can write larger data to a file, so you can only access files available to the application. So what you're doing is you're going to create a file, just like you create an icon as an example, and you put them in the resource directory. And the raw subdirectory, so we know resources have menus, they have windows, they have, well, the raw is supposed to be for anything that would be file oriented. So you can either write to a new file or pre-include under the resource or RES raw directory my data. It doesn't have to have a file extension. It's going to be opened and read or written to and from the file as if it were a file in the file system, but it is confined to the application again. So it's just something that application is going to use. So you can read data from a file, call context open file input, and pass it to the local name of the path of the file. Returns the standard Java file input stream object. So it's just like the Java I/O that we looked at. In fact, I believe I talked about the Java I/O on the Android a couple weeks back. So to write to a file, you call the context.openFileOutput with the name of the file, returns the file output stream of the object as well. So not a bad approach to reading and writing to files. Not on the SD card, I must say. It's just within the application space. So obviously you can tell there's probably some limitations to that. I don't know what it is, but there is a file size limitation associated with that. So you can also place data elsewhere on the network. A lot of companies actually do this. They put it on a website, or they put it somewhere on another server, and then they use the networking features of the phone to go get to that data. So you can use a web service to store data elsewhere. You can also bring in files elsewhere onto the phone. Because we're thinking about a small little device, it's got limited SD card space. It's going to copy stuff locally, cache it probably to run it on that device. But do we really need to store everything there? No, we can load it from elsewhere. So you can make this automatic or at the user's discretion, such as, like I say, a Twitter app, a photo capture. So you could photo capture, use the camera, take some pictures, take the pictures and upload them somewhere else, like to photo whatever, another Flickr or something like that, or another service out there where you can automatically upload them. So a lot of app developers sort of take that approach because you can fill up an SD card kind of quickly. So we can also have persistent data in a database, and this is what the Notepad application does. And you'd think if you were keeping notes that the notes would be stored in like text files, like Notepad on the computer. But the interesting thing is that the built-in example that comes with the SDK is taking it and using the database for it instead. Because the database has got more resources associated with it, it's going to run faster. It's not limited by file size or by quantity. So each API uses a built-in SQLite database. So each database is private to the application. So the application has its own database space. So in principle, you can expose the data if you expose the application as a content provider. And pretty soon we're going to be looking at content provider type of applications, but right now, just know that if you're keeping it per application, you're opening up a database, you're not sharing that database among different other applications. So all databases, SQLite and others, are stored in a device, and here's the device. Here's data within the data subdirectory, package underscore name databases. So each package has its own databases associated with it, which is per application. So here's an example of an application we're going to look at today. This is the one I tried to bring up last time, but it was I've solved the problem by upgrading the emulator to a 4.01 emulator. I've decided that it's probably better to go current anyway versus the older emulators, but we'll see it in a few minutes. The Android Notepad tutorial uses the database. So, and the tutorial is something that if you're following along with the course, you know you're doing for one of your assignments actually. And so useful for database helper class for accessing the crude details. And you probably should know that, you know, in terms of looking at the examples and using the stuff that's shipped with the SDK, it's not a bad option to get a feel for how it's done, but you probably should go through the tutorial anyway, just because it's a nice exercise. If you really want to learn how to do it, it's a better exercise, better learning tool. But there's no excuse for not doing the assignments for this course, essentially. So it creates a note. The note gets created. Looks like looks like binder paper here, and the information from the note is actually stored in a database, and it's stored as a database menu. We'll see that live in a few minutes. So, context menu is special. So we can acquire the context menu by holding down a selection key, and then it pops up. It kind of pops up at the bottom of the screen. Some of the emulators have the context menu sort of on the right-hand side of the emulator. Some of them have tools. A couple of the emulators that I'm using from VirtualBox have like a little round little circle thing you press on it. You get the context menu out of that. And in terms of unlocking the Android database, as an example, covers more complex. You can look at more complex examples if you unlock some of the database capabilities. And by saying unlock, it basically means give permission, essentially. And how we allow permissions for the Android, which is kind of common in terms of the terminology. But the concept being is we actually are unlocking it. We're allowing it to happen, allowing the application to work with a database. So you can store locations to databases within an application as an object, and then you can get at those locations. So here's an Android app example that uses a database helper in classes with SQL. So we're looking at one that's going to keep locations, and this is kind of like find your friends type of application, where you can look at a bunch of this is a particular screenshot here showing a weather reporter for different addresses, and then we'll report on the weather by going into a database and looking at, well, where is the address, the city, state, and then sending it out to another content provider. Essentially, it's going to pull back weather information, perhaps. So here what we've got is an example of the database helper. So part of the database helper class showing the location object here. So we have some strings holding the city, the region, the zip code. And the class also holds crude details about the map object. So we're combining this with a map so we can see the local area, longitude, latitude, stuff like that for the location of where that particular location might be on the map for the city and state. So in terms of mapping the objects to SQL, you can map them for use in terms of running a query. So we could put, as an example here, we can insert into content values for, let's say, for example, a city, a zip code, last alert, last time the person received an alert. So mapping makes coding a little bit easier in terms of being able to put in, and this would be essentially, you could put this in, this is actually using a preference file, actually. So we can set the city to the local city, the state or zip code to the local state and zip code. And then there's a little bit of an update method as well that's going to insert, update, do all sorts of things in terms of a database connectivity. So if you think about the concept of SQL, we can basically automate the query process by putting in key pairs, set city to this, state to that. So SQLite provides advanced database features as well. So there's a transaction support that's built right into it. And you can use the prepared statements based on the Java SQL. So if anyone is taking the Java EE course and has sat through some of those lectures on the JDBC connectivity, think of it sort of like the JDBC connectivity is built into the phone. So we can do prepared statements, you can do a connect an object, you can create a database object. All that stuff actually works the same way. As part of this, it's a different API, it's not JDBC, it's not called JDBC, but it works in the same fashion. It's all based from the same company. So you can set items that you've done before, making them faster, more secure. And you have a cursor to keep track of the location within the result sets as well. So the cursor concept also exists with the SQLite. So although it's called SQLite, it's pretty heavy. It's not quite as light as you'd think it was. It's light because it works on the phone. It doesn't take as much resources up, but in terms of functionality, it's actually kind of automated for you. It's pretty feature rich. So you can map objects to the database itself. So you can read items from the network as XML and convert the objects, which map to a database object, and then use the database object instead of the XML object or vice versa. It enables off network use and can sync later when connected. And it might be pushing the limits of the device, though, with extra classes and memory usage. So again, it is sort of a lightweight sort of feature of the phone in the application development environment. However, the more you use the database, the more data you put into it, the slower your app is going to run, actually, because you're talking about using a pretty heavy-duty, intense resource on a phone. So not too many database applications, per se. But the database is used as sort of a lightweight component to support the persistent data of an application. So a lot of people will use a database instead of preferences, or they'll use the database instead of a file, because it's a little bit easier to store, like, 10 items or something, or 20 items of something. If you're doing a huge query on that, it might make your app run a bit slow. So, which is why we have so many other alternatives. I mean, we have the preference files, we have the regular files, database files, or network access. In fact, the biggest trend right now is network access. Why load something on the phone when you don't have to? Access it from the internet. So everything, like example, you go to a YouTube app and you start looking at videos. They're not coming from files or local persistent storage. They're being streamed from internet connectivity. So it requires an internet feed. But as internet speeds get faster and faster, we're noticing that they're getting a little bit more reliable, a little bit more easier to work with as well. So a summary, you can use preferences for each of your apps. You can read and write to files, just as you would in Java. And can persist. You could read items over the network when available, and you can use SQLite, one database per app, actually. Actually, you could set up multiple tables in the database, but it's one database object that's created per app. The database objects aren't shared among the different apps. Alright, so last week I attempted to show you how to load examples. I'm going to wait until I load the ones I want to look at first, just in case I break the system again. But I decided last time that it wasn't me, it was the emulator. And I was right. So I decided instead, and here's another kind of thing, and a couple of notes to make about the emulator for those of you who are trying out the VirtualBox emulator. Important to keep track of what you've got installed on the emulators. I'm probably using a bad example of this because I don't have anything identified, but some of them I have loaded SD cards on them. And what you're looking at is the screen with 1, 2, 3, 4 emulators I've got on here. Some of them, I'm pretty good with the versions now. I'm starting to label them for which one this one is, which one that one is. But these are all ISO files, or some of them have been ISO files. And the ISO files have pre-installed stuff on them. And then when I run an app that I've gotten downloaded from the samples, and I put them in an ISO file that's pre-configured, it tells me, and it told me last week, sorry, Notepad, you're replacing Notepad, it's already there. Because it's not smart enough, because it's not installed. It's like a boot up disk, and you're running an app, and then you can't run the same app on the emulator that already has the app on it. Which was what the problem I was having last week, and I was looking at all the error messages and stuff that were coming out on the bottom of my screen here going, well, what does that mean? I can't run it because it's already installed. So then I decided, well, let's just install it. So I've taken a separate step here, and because I have multiple, I actually went and I called it Android because this one's installed. And that way I can remove stuff instead of running from a live disk. And then one that says emulator is the live one, which means it's not installed in a virtual hard drive space on the computer. Instead, I'm running the ISO image. So when the emulator boots up, because you have multiple options here. When the emulator boots up, you can put like a CD in there and have it boot to the CD, or you can actually run it as an operating system on top of that, which allows you to make changes. So what I did is I took and I created the 4.01 here, which is running right now, which is the more current version. And then that's the other thing too, I decided to upgrade a little bit, get some newer emulators in here as well. I probably should put a 3 in here. Haven't done it yet, but haven't found one I liked yet. But I installed this one, and I mounted a SD card on it, and I enabled certain features, and then I removed everything off of it, so it's empty. Now the examples work just fine. So if you run into this problem at home, and you're using VirtualBox, I tried the same thing with the Android emulator. I also believe, and I had the same problem with the Android emulator, it was because the sample app from the SDK was already on the emulator, and I was trying to run it and it didn't want to replace it for some reason. So the way you get around it, just to recap, install it instead of running the ISO image, strip it out, take all that crap off of there, because you can. The next time I reboot it, it's empty. So now what I have is a empty 4.01 ice cream. I think this is ice cream version, or one of the various different versions. So if I run it, I'm going to run it first because I know it works. Hopefully, cross my fingers. If I run the app right now, it should load it. And I'm picking. I tried it before I started the class, which is why I have that old emulator up there. And lo and behold, it works. So when I get done showing you what I want to show you, before I take the risk of breaking it, I'll show you how to load it on a clean emulator. But I don't want to do that until I don't want to risk breaking my system until I've shown you my examples today. Because last week I couldn't show you anything because I started out with that and I broke the system. I didn't really break the system. I just confused the emulators is what I did. So now we have a working emulator. This is good. So let's talk about this particular one, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see the source code. I'm going to work backwards. This is the Notepad app that comes with the Android developer that gets downloaded, and I'll wait till the very end to show you how to do that. From the SDK, which is essentially one of the most interesting ones that I can actually recommend that you look at. It's interesting because it uses the database features, and they've built this one for each one of the different versions of the SDK. So you're looking at the latest one for the 4.0 version. So there's different screens to this, and it's kind of a step up to some of the other examples that we've looked at so far. And I kind of want to preview this example for you so you can kind of see what the learning objective is in terms of that assignment that I'm having you do. The Notepad Editor is the editor screen that allows you to edit the notes. So it's it starts with the Notepad Editor. It's the main activity file of all of the other ones. Here we have Notepad, Notepad Provider, the list, the title editor. We'll see those as separate features. And actually, this sort of does follow the model view controller kind of format in terms of the app development, which is sort of an sort of an iPhone versus an Android concept, but it still works in terms of the concept. What we're looking at is creating a string. The string is going to be the information. The information is going to be loaded from notepad.notes, which is going to be the ID, the application title, the name of the note. Information is going to come through that we're going to use to populate out the screen. So it creates a projection that, which is nothing more than a string that can be parsed. It contains all of the information for the contents of the note that we're looking at. We have the label that's going to be that's saves the state, so save the saved state of the activity. The edit state, the state inserts. So what we're looking at in terms of the configuration of this program is that this editor, Notepad Editor, is holding the main functionality and the features of the Notepad, so which is our notes and our titles for the notes, and the contents of the notes, and when was the last time we saved them, and all the stuff associated with that. So the global mutable variables are associated with the states, are associated with the cursor information, the original contents, the changed contents if we're going to save something. And because it's going to read the information from a database, get the note with the title that's associated with it. So it's going to run a query on the database and say, you know, my note 1, my note 2, my note 3. Go to the database, find my note 1, take the text field, bring it back, populate it onto the GUI so you can kind of see the note, and allow you to change it. If there's no changes, it doesn't have to save anything, so it doesn't have to go back. So it's keeping track of the state as well. So the constructor is used by the layout inflator. So what we can do here is take, set the color, set the style, set the layout, inflate the items so that we can read and write to the text area of the screen. So we draw the lined edit text object, and we have the methods for all of the actions, so the onDraw, the onCreate, and you can go through this, and I'll show you how to download and install this actually. I don't have to even give this to you. You can get it yourself. You can go through this and kind of read through all of that, and it's very well documented actually, which is nice. But you can see all of the activity-oriented components, such as the onCreate, the onDrag, onSave, onState changes that occur in terms of the life of this object, which is going to be the node object. All of the events are captured, which is not a bad idea, and it's also using an intent. So the intent is for each one of the little notes actually to communicate with the application. So we can keep track of several different notes that are associated. And then we can send information. We saved this one, we opened this one, kind of back and forth. So we can get the action that was triggered with the intent filter. And here's our action by getting action from an intent. We can see if it was an edit action, if it was a save action, what the action actually was. In terms of an action insert, we can do this. If it's that, we can do that. So we can set up, like in this example, using an if-else to set up, what did we do with that particular note. You can do a case switch on it as well, whichever construct you like the best. And it's updating the log, obviously, so it's a debug kind of program because it's writing to the log. We know it. We strip those things out when we deliver these applications. So, but this one's for testing purposes. And so we're looking at the M cursor, which is going to be the managed query, and the cursor is by terminology is the information that we get back that's holding the result set. And the interesting part about the database, and the reason why I'm kind of going through this, in a traditional database environment, we have a database out there. We do a JDBC connection as an example. We go to the database. Actually, JDBC is not a good example of this because this uses a cursor as well. But let's just say we have another database out there and we're not using JDBC. We go to the database, we connect to the database, we run a query. The query comes back and it gives us our result set. And our result set is parsed. And the parsing of that result set ends up being populated out into like a dozen different variables that we've designed in the program to deal with the results. JDBC and also on the Android, we have this cursor concept that gets sent back. And the cursor concept is the container for the result set. It contains all of the information, the metadata, the data, all of the database-related contents that we have direct access to. Normally the cursor resides on the database. So in JDBC, what made that really nice was that, the cursor, we can actually access the cursor information in the application through the JDBC connectivity. Android works the same way. In fact, it's using a very similar interface. We can read and write to the cursor. What's the cursor? It's the memory from the database that's holding the contents of the result set. So instead of dealing with a result set object, we can look at the cursor, and we can manage things. We can manage how much space is available. We can manage what's in the database, what we're looking at. We can parse, dissect out the result set, know what each one of the columns is, know all the information associated with it. So some database terminology call it a projection, by the way. So when we project something, usually you see that terminology used with subqueries that are turned into projections. So if I take, I have 3 tables, and one of them, actually the only thing I can think about projections is an example I used in my database class with beers, bars, and drinkers. So one, you want to find out which bar Mary can go to order drinks, and you know what Mary likes to drink. So you query the bar with, she likes Bud Light, so you query the bar with Bud Light and you find out which bars sell Bud Light, and that's a projection. And then you run a query on that as to which bars that Mary likes that sell Bud Light. So instead of running all of the queries one right after the other and dealing with the information that comes back from those queries in a non kind of cursor mode, instead, you could deal with the cursor. The cursor is a projection, so you get the list of all the bars that sell Bud Light, and you get the list of all of the beers that all the bars that Mary likes, and you intercept it so you can figure out, well, which ones are good candidates to suggest to Mary, which is kind of sort of like how applications are working on the phone, on the Android phone. So you're in a particular area, you capture the location where you're at, and you say, I want to eat, or I want to go to the movies, right? So then it finds all of the movies that are in your area. Well, what movie do you want to watch? I want to watch this movie. So here's all the movies that are in your area, working with the cursor. We've already done that query. We've got that coming back from the content provider, actually, probably. Who knows? Maybe it's your database in your app that's doing that, storing that information, which you very well could. Hard to set all the names of all the movie theaters. Then query the movie theaters that are in the area for the movie that you want to see. And then you can take it a step further and say, okay, this is the movie that I want to see at the movie theaters that are in my area. What time do you want to see it at? And then it comes back and says, this theater here has it at the time that you want it. So it tells you which one you want to go to, which is a nice kind of app. If you're thinking about app development, it's kind of, that's how people think in terms of writing apps versus applications that run on computers. What do people want to use this thing for? So the concept of the cursor comes in handy because you can nest it with multiple queries. You can kind of use it in other contexts inside of your application to do all sorts of fancy stuff out of it. That was a long explanation of the concept of a projection and a cursor, but that's what the concept is sort of getting at in terms of and you can read through the notes here. So the intent is going to be an action paste, if you're doing a paste or a cut or whatever happens to be the action that you're performing. On a resume, it's going to show you all the list of the notes that are in there. So you didn't find this note, so then you do a requery or something, or all the activities that's going to occur in terms of that. On a save instance, saving it. On a pause, all the different process states that might exist in terms of switching back and forth between different notes in the context of a Notepad application. Notepad is the application. So this one here, we have the class Notepad. And on class Notepad, we're going to use the authority Google Provider Notepad, which is a database that's already set up for us. So in this particular example, it's using a content provider. The content provider is essentially the pre-installed app functionality for Notepad, which is the Notepad, which is why I was having a problem actually, because it's the Notepad that's on the phone by default in the emulator. So if you're going to try and reinvent the wheel, make sure you don't have another one on there to begin with, because if you try to recreate it, it's not going to work. So class cannot be instantiated. Instead, it's an abstract class that we're going to inherit from. We're going to take and inherit from Notepad. So notes table contract. So we've got the base columns of the table, and this is basically giving us our table name called notes and our content from the scheme from the content provider, from the URI that we're going to use for this, and all the different paths for all of the different sections, the IDs, the notes themselves, the position number, how many notes are we going to have in there, the content URI information in terms of the scheme that we're going to do, given the content provider details. And then all of the strings themselves for all of the different components, the content type, the content item type, the sort order, modified in descending order. Last one's by the modification date. So it's using a combination of the database, but the database is pre-configured already, so we don't have to set up the database. If you were writing this app from scratch, you would actually have to set up the database. You'd have to actually create the table and create all of the information in there. Instead, we're using a combination of the content provider plus the database to populate all the notes in terms of what we're doing. And it's a built-in Google functionality. So a lot of people actually use it when they want to keep track of notes, because why not? It's an easy kind of service to kind of just not have to reinvent. So here's the Notepad provider. And this particular class is going to be implementing the pipe data writer from the cursor. So it's reading and writing to the cursor that's coming out from the database query that's giving us our notes, as I was mentioning before. So the tag for the logging of the messages for any errors is going to be Notepad provider. The database name is going to be Notepad, note_pad db. Databases are actually stored in the form of a file, actually, which is another kind of interesting thing. Unlike, let's say, for example, Oracle or MySQL or something, where we don't normally have files. This is actually kind of implemented sort of like a client-server database that's implemented like Microsoft Access. Where we have, instead of MDB, we have DB files, and they're not Microsoft compatible, but the data is actually stored in a file. You can actually get to it, and you can actually remove these DB files if you wanted to, but you're not going to, because you'd actually have to do it within the app, actually, to get rid of it, because you don't have access to it outside of the app. So, alright, so the database version, the map, selected columns, things like that, stuff that you're going to use. So this is going to be set up as a hash map, and it's using a template class, actually. So it's inheriting from the... In fact, this is the same thing that was in the data structures course, if you had taken that course, looking at the Java implementation of HashMap. And then we've got the read notes projection, which is going to be a string that's going to have all of the information associated with the note, the title itself, the contents of the note, things of that nature. So it's separated out into the content provider, which is going to give us all of our, add this note, add that note, give permissions for that, give permissions for that over there. And basically, it's basically communicating and communicating with the Google provider to set up the interface that we're going to need for our application to send and receive to get that information. The other items here are associated with the actual notes in the application development. So the notes list is going to be that list box, or excuse me, I think it's going to be a scrollable list for all of the notes that are being saved in the interface. Item 1, item 2, item 3, which is going to give us our note list. And then so we can call to it from an action. In fact, if we look at the XML file for it, in terms of the layout, we can see we've got a note editor, a note list, and a note title editor layout that we can run. And I'm hoping it's going to load. Yeah, if not, I will. Oh, there we go. So, which is basically we're adding it dynamically, so there's nothing going to be on there. But the menu, I believe there's a context menu on here as well. Yes, and the menu items are going to be for the listing out items. And the context menu on here is going to show up on the menu bar. In other emulators or other versions, it actually shows up as a context menu. So you press the context menu item, and it brings up the bottom portion of the screen, brings up the context menu. And here, I believe, it's going to show up on the title bar. So they made a few revisions to this program as they've gone through the different SDKs. And I'll show you how to load this program at the very end so you know what I'm talking about. But all right, so the rest of it, the notes live folder, is just going to give us our abstraction in terms of all of the notes that we've saved. It's actually here. So it's a depreciated library for the onCreate. Okay. Well, Alright, so the folder itself is going to be the items that are going to be set for each one of the notes that we're going to be keeping in this abstraction. The edit the title functionality is nothing more than editing what you're going to call the note, and you're going to using the content provider to actually store the notes. So you're going to call a functionality to edit the title of the note. So each one of the notes has a unique title. So if you try to save the same note with the same title, it actually corrupts it. So there's no error checking in here either. Alright, so if we run it, we get, as an Android application, and I'm going to run it in my 4.01 emulator. Oops. Oh, wrong direction. So I can see it on the screen. And it's sleeping. Here it is. So it loads up actually, and we can, oh, can't make the screen bigger. Hold on a second. Oops. I can crash it, however. Oh, there we go. Well, let's just leave it alone for a second. It seems to be working. If I click on this is a test, it should open up the note, which it does open up. And so, unfortunately, Notepad has stopped. Yes. My emulator is not working. Actually, Notepad should be installed in here already. So let's take a look here. I believe I called it My Android app. No, it's called My Notepad. No, it's not on here. I'm going to try it one more time to load it from Android. Did that just crash again? It did. Of course, it's probably the recording software, and it's probably running low on memory is what the problem is right now. Let's just see. It's back up, and there's the notes. Okay, so up in the right-hand corner of the screen, if I were to touch on that or to click on that, it should create the note. Here's, okay, it is working now. This is good. We'll just leave this alone for right now. The context menu is actually showing up on the menu bar. In this particular version of it, it's not set as a context menu, which is good because this emulator doesn't actually have a context menu on it. But this is the interface, so if I typed in this is another notes. It has a spell checker on here too, it looks like. Hello world. And I click on the save, it should hopefully save it to the database, which it did. And so it's using the first title, first line of the note to actually present the title to me. So, there we go. So we're working with a spell checker in here. So this is the more modern, this is the current version of the Notepad. These features, however, are not in the previous API releases. And what am I talking about when I say the API releases? If I were to, for example, decide I don't want this, actually, let's take it out. I've already showed it to you. So now I'm not risking the danger of messing up my system here. It's running. Let me exit out of here. So it's not in here anymore. I did get an error message though when I tried to remove it. If I wanted to recreate that project, and this is what I was trying to demo last week, and hopefully it will work this week. If I go File, New, Android Project, and I were to say, for example, I want to create, and I want to use from existing sample, and I go Next, I actually don't even need to put a name in here either. If I'm going to bring it in from an existing sample, you pick the API version. I know this one has been working, so I'm going to keep it on this one because besides this emulator, hopefully, I'm going to call it my Notepad, hopefully it will not complain again. This is where you can get all sorts of fun stuff. In fact, let me just try something else now. I'm going to try the tic-tac-toe game instead, just to be safe. But I'm pretty sure I can bring that Notepad back. The Notepad one that I was showing you a few minutes ago is this one up here. This one right here. So, long story short, this is how you're getting the examples in, and according to what I was showing you last week with the, and I'll review that for a second as well for those people who missed it. If you go into the window and you look at the Android SDK manager, those items that you're seeing in the list are coming from the samples for the SDK if you have them installed. So if you if you're going through that process and you're not seeing that big old list of stuff, or you're not seeing 4.0 something, or you're not seeing 3.0 something in terms of the API release, API version, it means you don't have it installed. So you can go backward all the way through the history, you can go forward all the way to the current one, but it's these samples here. In fact, I don't have it installed for I don't have anything on 3.0 installed yet. But these are the ones that are showing up into that window. This is going to be extremely helpful for the assignments for this course. So there's no excuse why people, and I'm still going to get the messages, the assignments are kind of hard. I'm like, no, they're not. The assignments are not hard. So here's the tic-tac-toe game, and I'm going to get, I'm going to see why we have issues here. 1 second. Starts game activity. Well, tic-tac-toe's got some red stuff next to it. I'm going to leave it alone, actually. Let's see if I can bring back the Notepad application. I know that one works. Actually, now it's called Notepad, and well, that's good. Let's see. See what happens if I run it. I have selected the wrong emulator. No, my emulator's still up there. Well, it's a good thing I ran it to before I started doing this, because it's complaining about the emulator. The emulator I've got running is a 4.03. Oh, no, I selected the one for 4.03. I have a 4.01 emulator, so I'm going to delete this again. Ah, perfect. I'm going to try it one more time with a 4.01 emulator. If you can't get the examples to work and you're doing what I'm doing here, this is the troubleshooting steps you're going to go through. I don't have a 4.01. Well, I have a 4.0. Let's try that one out. See if that, at least it's not greater than the emulator that I'm trying to run it in. So I'm going to go next. Finish. Give it a few minutes. Should not have a red. I have to give it a few minutes here. Actually, cleaning up the project sometimes helps. Oh, there it goes. See? Oh, nope, it's back. Well, okay. Nope, now we're good again. Let's see. Hold my luck. Will it work? 4.01. Got the green arrow. It's gonna work. Got a broken pipe error message down there. Got nothing going on in here. Ah, here we go, notes. Lo and behold. And you might discover, well, what happened there? Well, alright, so it loaded it, but now I got these 2 notes that are in here that are left over from last time. The database wasn't cleaned up, which meant I installed the ISO file on the emulator, and the emulator is storing the data from the database and the content provider, and it knows it's already there, so I uninstalled it, reinstalled it, ran it again. The old data is still there. So unfortunately, for testing purposes, that gives you problems, because now I don't know if it's clean or not, so I'd have to actually go through and delete the data. So long story short, the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes the problem's not with Eclipse, sometimes it's not with the emulator, but it's with using combinations of different things over and over again that causes the issue. So, but the tic-tac-toe game should work as well. I'm not quite sure why the tic-tac-toe game has got a asterisk next to it, outside of the fact that perhaps maybe that one is also for 4.01, which it might be. So if I go in and try and reduplicate that one and go in and select something for 4.0 instead of 4.03, and let's pick something different. Random music player. What is Snake? You want to try that one out? Let's see, I'm just going to pick that. I've never seen Snake. Let's just try that at random. Snake. Snake should run. Well, that was interesting. Maybe that's what Snake does. I'm not sure what Snake does. But I don't like what happened though. Everything's on its side now. So I want to assume that something ran. That's interesting. My mouse is working in opposite direction as well. This is interesting. I can't get it up to see run Snake again. Oh yeah, there we go. Hold on one second. Well, I don't see it on there. Oh, there's a snake on a phone. Oops, wait a minute. Let me move my mouse in the opposite direction here. I almost had it up there. That's the Notes app right there, actually. There we go. Snake up to play. Snake press up to play. Oh, this is not good either. You know what happened? I believe it put it in the landscape instead of portrait mode so that we could play this lovely game. But, well, I believe on the built-in emulator you can change the orientation. On the VirtualBox emulator, I have not personally tried that yet. So that'll be my homework for this week. How do I change the orientation back? Interesting. So we see that Snake is actually working. It's a video game. It's a game that it changes the orientation to landscape. So that was actually that proved to be a good example. Then why the tic-tac-toe is not working? Let's just see for. Actually, you know what I'm going to need to do? I'm going to need to reset this emulator anyway. I'll show you one more example, then we'll call it quits for today. So, let's see. Why the emulator keeps rebooting. Oops, wrong emulator. I don't want that one. I want the 4.01. That emulator was rebooting as well for some strange reason. Here's another little trick that I noticed as well. See, I've got it, well, it didn't let me. I didn't press it fast enough. I've got it loaded from a hard drive. So it'll actually have the memory of Snake and all of the other applications that I just ran on here because they got stored, which is nice because then I have to keep loading them back up again if I wanted to play them. But unfortunately, it does require me to go and delete stuff. As an example, those notes and stuff like that have to actually get deleted. They'll stay in the memory. The other thing I noticed is, like, for example, I just reset the emulator. If I were to go out and connect to it, I would actually have to connect again to it. So once it breaks the port, but it actually put it back on 5555, which is kind of interesting. But when you close the emulator, every time you close the emulator, it's probably not a bad idea to set your connection back if you're using this technique. But anyway, I was going to see one more thing. I was going to try the tic-tac-toe game in the proper editor, and let's see if it works, in the proper emulator. Because I was using a 4.03. What I need to do is find a 4.03 emulator to actually have that work in. Tic-tac-toe main. What's the difference between tic-tac? See, now, if they wanted to improve this interface, they should add a little description. I'm going to just say main and see if that happens. Tic-tac-toe lib. I believe I might actually have to install both of these. No. Tic-tac-toe main. So I believe the problem that I was having is I only had one of them installed. Perhaps you have to install both of them. Then maybe they're working together. Who knows? But now I noticed that when I installed the lib, the main, actually, the red arrow went away. The red, the red Xbox. Let's take a look here real quick. Nope, emulator's up. Emulator's locked. Let me unlock the emulator. Here's my tic-tac-toe sample. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger. I can. Let's see. Kind of dark as well for some reason. Well, it's because of the black. So it's a tic-tac-toe game. It has a classic test. It actually works, which is nice. I don't know if it was this class or the iPhone class I have you make a tic-tac-toe game in it. I think it's the iPhone class, actually. So this is not going to help you for this class, but Hello, I'm stuck now. And my emulator crashed once again. But, oh, no, it didn't. It's back. Not quite sure why the emulator is doing that. But apparently, it seems to be working. So you might want to experiment with that as well. So, and that's what I was basically trying to show you last week. But unfortunately, the emulator was not still not working perfect today. But at least it was working a little bit better today than it was last week. So long story short, if you want to, you can experiment with all of the examples and all of the samples. Those are the same ones that you're going to see on the Android site. So on the Android developer site, on the tutorials, those are the finished products of all the tutorials, by the way, as well. So the database one is not a bad one to take a look at. The Notepad one would be the database one, or the content provider one. There's a one for Bluetooth, there's one for a bunch of other features as well. So most of the hardware features, the orientation features, everything has a sample app out there for you. So I will leave you with that today. So last week I went too long, so today I'll make it shorter to compensate. Questions, comments, or concerns? You guys are working with, and you guys are starting the assignments, right? Because we know you have, oh yeah, I can update you on the final exam. Final exam for this course is going to be, I've recently decided this, Monday, the 23rd. And I'm also going to hold exams on Wednesday, the 25th of April. So what we're looking at is 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, about 4 weeks left. Because we still have another week in March. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. You'll have the option of the 23rd or the 25th to take the exam. And all assignments are due on May 1st. So you have a month left to do 5 assignments if you haven't started on them yet. You can take them both on the same day, because you guys are weekday students. You can take them, all of them, on the same day. And they don't have to be on Monday either. You can take them on Wednesday. Any other questions, comments, or concerns? Then we're done for today. Let's stop this video.